Well, hello everyone. This is Schwaner, your professor from Corrections, and I would like to discuss your assignment that's coming up next week, writing on an institution, writing about a particular institution in the United States, and there's many interesting ones to discuss. Just writing a quick message here. All right. Many of them. There's Lucasville. There's Santa Fe. There's Pelican Bay. You just start thinking about it, looking up different Attica, Eastern Penn. So you start thinking about all these different Walnut Street, which is historical. You start thinking about corrections, and you start thinking about actually the architecture of the actual buildings. We don't think much about architecture when we think about corrections and when we think about criminology. But what's interesting is that the architecture that is used to construct prisons is actually a reflection of societal ideology, societal methods of thinking about crime and punishment. So in this assignment, even though I think the tendency is really going to be for you to pick a prison, Leavenworth, whatever it's going to be, Rikers Island, what have you, you're going to pick something and then you're going to describe it. And really, I don't want you to describe it so much, right? What I really want you to do is find a way to actually analyze the central history of that prison, the context in which that prison was constructed, the method and the reason for that prison. Is it there because of the philosophies behind corrections? That is it there because of retribution, which is, was that prison constructed just to extract revenge from society, right? Was it there just to warehouse inmates? That is, just to hold them there until they do their time and then release them back into society? Is it there because of the philosophy of rehabilitation, right? In other words, is it there because we regard the individual as sick and misled, and therefore it is our job to help them feel better by giving them the right programmatic type of activity so that they can be rehabilitated? Restitution may not fit in there, but you can also have the philosophy of incapacitation. And incapacitation is different than incarceration. All right? Incarceration is where we send people off to prison or jail or what have you so they can turn their time. Incapacitation is different. Incapacitation is the philosophy. What is this? Alexa came up on my screen. I'm sorry. I guess she wanted to take over the show. Incapacitation means the removal of a person from society. All right? It's not just about punishment, it's about removal. So if you incapacitate, you could do like they did with Napoleon and send him off to Devil's Island. Or you could do like the British did and send their inmates down to Australia or to their other penal colony, America, and incapacitate them, remove them from society, and still give them some kind of punishment. By the way, the death penalty is a form of incapacitation, right? Because it's the ultimate removal from society. So when you think about the different philosophies, retribution, incapacitation, warehousing, etc., which philosophy, rehabilitation, which philosophy are we using? Because the philosophy is going to determine the nature of the architecture, the way in which your institution is delivered. Okay? And there's another one that I don't know if it's in the literature yet, but it's one that my advisor talked about 20 years ago, and that was a technocratic type of incapacitation. In other words, where we use technology to incarcerate people based upon their wrongdoing, which in that way, then you can use house arrest and things like that. And there's, of course, community corrections, where people are placed back in the community, either under probation or on parole or in a halfway house or what have you. So when we take a look at the prison itself, it is the node in the criminal justice system. It is the node in the correctional system. In other words, someone asked me today in a text message, and these are the kind of questions I love, right? I love these kind of questions. The question was, are the courts a part of the correctional institution? Right? The textbook says yes, and I would tend to agree, because the sentences that are given out are done in the court to land a person in prison or probation or acquitted or what have you. So the nature of punishment, by the way, the nature of a sentence, right? Whether it's a determinate sentence or an indeterminate sentence. Determinate sentence is just basically a fixed sentence. You get 5 years, boom, you're in, you're out in 5. But an indeterminate sentence essentially assumes that you might get over, the punishment might work for you, the rehabilitation might work for you in a different time frame. So the rule of thumb is that if you're a perfectly behaved inmate, you go through all the programs and all the programs, what will happen is we will reduce your sentence by 1/3, good behavior and stuff like that. Incidentally, and we're going to get to the philosophy behind punishment here in just a second, and take a look at sentencing. Sentencing determines the nature of what your removal from society is going to look like and your return back to society. So if it is a punishment, right, if it's an extraction of revenge, if it's retribution, then this is where you do the time, or you do the crime, you do the time, right? So you get out in 5 years, and when you get out in 5 years, right, there's no parole. You're done. You did your time, and now it's time for you to go ahead and work your way back into society. I am sorry, it's possible, it looks like there might be some technical difficulties right in here, but I just know that, I do know that there are often issues with Wi-Fi in my home where I do these videos from. Unlike when I was out of state, the Wi-Fi was not a problem. Hold on 1 second. So we take a look at these institutions, correct? And we look at, let's say, for example, the Eastern Pen. All right, the Walnut Street Jail was the first prison in America, but the Eastern Pen was also, the first one, and it was a reformatory, right? In other words, it was a penitentiary, the Eastern Penitentiary. And the Eastern Pen was based upon this idea that a person who commits a crime is basically breaking the covenants with God. And therefore, they need to serve penitence when they are incarcerated. Okay, so when we have the Eastern Pen, what happened, or the Western Penitentiary, whichever one, or you have where Shawshank Redemption was filmed, which was that was the Mansfield Reformatory, which it's a different philosophy, right? That's therefore the name. So if you take a look at the Eastern Pen, essentially what the philosophy was that everybody who goes to prison should be in an isolated cell, basically 6 feet by 6 feet, maybe 8 feet by 8 feet, and they have a little back patio of 2 feet by 2 feet and a Bible, and food is delivered to them, and when the food is delivered, they eat it. Basically, it's solitary confinement, and the idea is that if you're sitting in your prison and you read the Bible, you will be penitent, and you can basically religion away your sins and therefore be returned back to society as a whole and complete person. And therefore, the whole prison was set up as a penitentiary. So it was constructed in a way where you had isolation, and in that quiet and silent system, it was called the silent system, right? In that silent system, you couldn't speak to anybody else. Now, when you had the Auburn system, which is where you have the black and white stripes that you see in the movies, the black and white stripes tied to the Auburn system was also a silent system. However, they had a different type of system, and essentially what they could do was they could work, but they couldn't talk. And what we found was, especially with the penitentiary, that socialized, and you're finding it now, right? I mean, you're hearing about the rise of mental illness because people are so isolated during the coronavirus, and that coronavirus isolation is causing issues of depression, a lot of occurrence of alcoholism, an increase in spike in alcoholism, drugs, and etc. And essentially what's happening is that isolation, because human beings are social, right? We have a social contract with one another. A person who breaks a social contract through crime, through criminal activity, ends up in the prison system, right? So if the fundamental assumption from the Enlightenment period is that we are all contractual beings, that is, we always have a social contract with one another, then that social contract, when it's broken, we get removed, right? But the assumption is that as human beings, we're always social, right? The social contract. Therefore, now that we are in our homes a lot more often, now that we're isolated, and now with the coronavirus spiking again, we find ourselves a lot more isolated than we had before, and we're seeing the rise of mental illness. The penitentiary failed largely because you had such an increase in mental health issues. You had people who were coming in relatively, quote unquote, normal, but they were losing their mental faculties through the isolation. And then you had something like the Walnut Street Jail, right? The Walnut Street Jail in Philadelphia was the first prison in America, but it was a, man, how can I put it? It was a torture chamber, essentially, is what it was. You had men in there, you had women in there, you had children in there, you had no real form of removal of waste, right? So you couldn't take excrement and urine and remove it. You had, rats were living in there, so it was a nasty, nasty place to go. And because what we regarded then is that if you were engaging in a crime that is against God's will, then we put you all together. You're all the same. Sinners are all sinners, so we throw you into the jail, the Walnut Street Jail, and we didn't categorize based upon child. We didn't categorize based upon gender. And as you can imagine, the exploitation inside that facility was pretty grotesque. But in any case, the first jail, and it's an interesting jail. When I lived in Philadelphia, I used to walk up and down Walnut Street because my school that I attended was on 13th and Walnut Street. It was an off-campus study program through Denison University. What was it called? It was called the Philadelphia Urban Semester. And I worked for the Philadelphia 76ers as part of my internship program, which was in and of itself a fantastic experience. One of the things that I saw is me and a couple friends of mine went up to New York City. We went to Times Square one night, and we had a blast. And we decided that since we were going to stay in this hotel, but you can't stay in a hotel when they gave us, when we walked into the hotel, it was a motel, and we were right across the street from the train station in Trenton, New Jersey, because we caught the train at Madison Square Garden heading back to Philly, but when you get to Trenton at like 2 o'clock in the morning, there are no trains until 7 a.m. going to Philly, so we said, oh man, okay, I guess we'll just go ahead and go to that little motel across the street. We go to the motel, it was like $20 a night, which I'm like, that's kind of shady. And then they handed us the sheets and the pillowcases in a plastic bag. I'm like, no, man. I said, we can't. Hey, Bob, come on, man. We can't, Chris, we can't stay here. They're giving out, they're giving the sheets and stuff in plastic bags. So I said, nah, we'll go ahead and go back over to the train station. So we slept in the train station. And it was an interesting night. I mean, there was a bunch of homeless men, and we were all sharing stories and stuff. And you couldn't sleep. You could sleep sitting up, but if you laid sideways, the police would wake you up. So it was kind of a weird night. But in any case, the next morning, when we did catch the train, it was a rainy morning. And as we were heading south on the is it called the Tri-Rail? No, that's here in Miami. The SEPTA, S-E-P-T-A. We're riding SEPTA back down. It's like the Tri-Rail. And as we were passing by the Eastern Penitentiary, it was weird because in the sky just above the pen, there was this blue sky and everything else was raining. So this huge rainbow emanated right out of the center part of the penitentiary. And I was like, man, isn't that incredible, right? So even though that didn't have much to do with my story, didn't have anything to do with the class, but it was an amazing place because it was like a fortress from in a movie, right? You had the big walls, then you had the building that was removed like 50, 100 feet away from the walls, had the barbed wire, and you had the great big, you had the guard watch areas. And I looked at it, I didn't know that it was such a historically important place. And dropping my cousin off at Rhode Island School of Johnson & Wales, we went by Attica, which of course had one of the greatest riots in the United States history in 1968. It was an awful riot. People were tortured. We were in the process of looking for obtaining rights. Inmates were looking for rights because during the 1960s, you have this situation where you have civil rights, equal rights for women. You have gay rights, and you also have prisoner rights. So everybody was looking at a way to overthrow the system, and in an attempt to empower themselves, the inmates took over Attica. when they took over Attica, I mean, they were torturing and maiming guards, or anybody who was a informant. They were tortured to death, and as it turned out, the warden said, if you lose the prison, you lose society. And what he was basically making the connection is that there's a link between society and corrections, right? And it's not just a little link, it's a huge link. So when we start to see the fall of the penitentiary theory, the ideology, around 1870, right, coming right off of the Emancipation Proclamation and the ending of slavery in 1870, we start to see the rise of something different. And in the 1840s, 1850s was the rise of social Darwinism, right? In other words, a period of time when we believed that we could explain human behavior using science. So instead of just saying, that God was shaping the philosophy of our punishment system, now we're saying, you know what, we can use science instead to cure the ills of inmates, because now we're starting to see a sickness model. So by 1870, Zebulon Brockway out of Cincinnati, he becomes the first warden of a reformatory. And the reformatory movement basically was the idea that we can reform people, right? So that Reformation was tied to, and it ushered in a new way of thinking about punishment, because it was in 1870 that we created what is called indeterminate sentencing. Indeterminate sentencing basically means, like I said earlier, is that some people are more sick than others, and other people are less sick than others. And so, therefore, a person who is cured more quickly, can earn their way out of prison. So you start to see the mark system, you start to see the point system, you start seeing people get points for good behavior, and then if they have enough points, they can reduce, or they can get more privileges within the system. And as they get more privileges, their release becomes earlier and earlier. The problem is that, practicing and implementing a theory is a whole lot more difficult in practice than it is in theory. So when we go to Cincinnati, where Zebulon Brockway opened up where they started the reformatory, what happens is he was brutal. He beat the inmates, right? He whipped them with belts and all kinds of things. I mean, they used isolation. They did everything that was not reform oriented. And so that's where you have that kind of thing. And then on the mental health side, you have places called the insane asylum, right? Then you also have the house of the feeble-minded. In other words, you're feeble in mind, and so therefore you have to be punished in a mental institution. And you have the state mental institutions, all these different kind of things. But when you take a look at them, what you're really looking at is a system that reflects, right? That reflects a dominant philosophy at a given time. So by the time the 1970s come, we start to see some transformation. We start seeing an overlap between the punishment model with prisons and penitentiaries and departments of corrections and reformatories with the rehabilitation reformatories. So we're starting to see that there's like a division as to which philosophy should be correct. Well, what happens is that with indeterminacy, we learn that, here's what happened, is that in the 1970s, there was a convergence between liberals and conservatives when it came to corrections. It was the first time, one of the few times, that there was an agreement by both political sides on anything, right? And basically what they said is rehabilitation had failed. On the liberal side, what they were saying is that we were giving sentences to the poor, to minorities, that otherwise would be given some kind of community service. So what we were doing is we're using indeterminate sentencing to house the poor, right, instead of the wealthy. And this is a period, right, coming through the 1960s when we're protesting everything. We're protesting the establishment. And in the protest of the establishment, Edwin Sutherland had written that we have a different system for those who engage in white-collar crime. So white-collar criminals, we're saying, well, they don't get to go to prison. They're not going into the reformatories, and they're not going into the penitentiaries, and they're not going into, the houses of correction. They're getting a whole different thing. So the argument by the liberals was, look, we're using rehabilitation to put otherwise people who would get probation or something else or a different type of sentence into prison. So it was unfair and unequal to those who were poor and minority. And the conservatives were saying, look, it doesn't make any sense. Why does some people get a longer sentence, other people don't get a longer sentences? If you do the crime, you do the time. It's simple. This medical model doesn't make any sense, right? Because take a look at the recidivism rate. Their argument is that the recidivism rate was so high that it was obvious that rehabilitation didn't work. And like I mentioned 2 or 3 weeks ago with Robert Martinson, 1973, he published an article that empirically, it was called meta-analysis, which is where he systematically quantified every academic article written on rehabilitation, and he found, and here is the quote, nothing works, right? So now you start to get this movement of truth in sentencing. You start to get this movement of get tough on crime. You start to get this movement of if you do the crime, you do the time. In other words, lock them up and throw away the key. In 1973, we see the complete obliteration of indeterminacy and the rise of determinacy. That is a fixed sentence. We start to see the punishment model take over. Now and you see it's coming back, right? Because it was a law and order campaign. Now, Trump is very directly says I'm law and order, but the fact of the matter is that Biden's voting record, as well as Bill Clinton, they weren't exactly soft on crime either. They were very much get tough on crime too. As a matter of fact, Joe Biden was one of the sponsors of one of the most extreme and severe laws ever written in the United States, and one that was so powerful that the incarceration rate for African American men in particular skyrocketed after the 1986 Omnibus Drug Law and the Get Tough in Sentencing 1994 Act. In other words, if you listen to the author, what's his name? His name is Michael Tonry. He wrote a book called Malign Neglect. And in that book, Malign Neglect, he basically argued that those laws, particularly the drug law, was specifically designed knowing that it was going to destroy urban African American men in particular, and women too. So they passed the law knowing that what they were really constructing was a new ghetto prison pipeline. And that was the argument that he made. And what we see in 1973, when we shift from the pendulum swinging from rehabilitation over to punishment, when that pendulum swung over, we started building tons of prisons, and our incarceration rate from 1973 up until really recently just kept going up. I mean, we had over 1 million people in prison. I think it was 2010 is when we crossed that number, and now we're at 1.2, 1.3 million people in prison. Jails, the whole nother number. So when we start to take a look at the impact was tremendous. We became the society that had the highest incarceration rates in the world. Not just in America, in the world we had the highest incarceration rates. And what happens is that we keep building more beds. And the thing is, if you build a bed, you're going to fill it, right? So people who ordinarily may have gotten probation or, hey, Radio, what's going on, or something of that nature, now they're going to prison. And the cost was profound because the dollar value, we couldn't afford the war on drugs. So the war on drugs in it started around 73, but the law and the legislation was really passed in 86. When you start to see the war on drugs, you start seeing prisons become warehouses. See, so now when we take a look at the prisons that were built in the 80s and the 90s, you're looking at warehouses. Under the reformatory, or under the rehabilitation, you see reformatories. Under the religious model, you see penitentiaries. Now, and here's my prediction, if we take a look 20, 50 years from now, 20 to 50 years, you won't need prisons at all. And the reason is simply because the technology that we have at our disposal will be able to monitor everything you do at any given moment. So if you are heading out, if you're getting angry, we'll have electrodes that can basically sense your anger and send it. It's kind of like Minority Report. We have, with the infrared technology, we know your whereabouts. So if you were to get, and then you take a company like Nvidia, which I love Nvidia if you're looking for investments, it dropped $30 today, so you have a great entry point to buy in. But if you start to take a look at what they're doing, they're creating deep learning for cameras, for security cameras, so that every time you walk by a camera, instead of them going and saying, okay, Sean was in Shell buying a Coke Zero at 4 o'clock, okay, but then we don't have anything else to say, then we have to go separately to mobile where I got my gas, and then we go over to Target, and then we say we need this camera. Instead, what they've done is they've created a technology that it is seamless. You don't have to go to every camera. The cameras through face recognition is going to create a deep profile of every single person. So in that deep profile, you can't just get away and just say, you know what, I wasn't there. I wasn't there. No, because we know you were there because of facial recognition, right? So if you take a look at corrections now with technology, corrections is implemented at the street level, okay? That's where it becomes complicated. So what I really want you to do when you go to write this paper for next Sunday, 9 days from now, right? When you go to write that, I want you to think about the context in which that institution was constructed. What's the philosophy behind it? What was taking place in terms of economics? Part of the reason why we've had to soften up on crime recently is because we just couldn't afford to send all these people to prison. We can't afford the billions upon billions of dollars it takes to run a get tough policy. However, right, if Trump wins, we know that we're swinging right back towards a get tough policy. Oh, that's the other thing. In the 1990s, we were swinging toward, just like in policing, we were swinging towards a community corrections model. If you go back to get tough, more people are going to go to prison, and then you're going to have all those issues again. And as far as like, you can think of things such as delivery of services. How do you deliver food 3 times a day for 1.2 million people? It's a logistics question, right? It's a business question. What's the profitability? What's the loss? Oh, that's another one. Private prisons, right? You know, publicly traded companies like Corrections Corporation of America. How do you have a private prison, right? What was that judge? I can't remember, about 4 or 5 years ago. He had actually sentenced, I think it was 3,000 young African American men to prison for crimes they didn't commit, because every time he sent somebody to prison, he got paid, right? It was kind of like he was an employee for whoever the prison was, and of course now he's in prison, and you know there's all kinds of lawsuits tied to the fact that a lot of these young kids just didn't do any crime, but he sent them away anyhow. So you have the corruption in there. But back to the point. Point is, take a look at an institution. All right, Pelican Bay is a great one. Of course, California is loaded with them. Arizona has prisons. You know, even pick some of the more the smaller ones like Franklin Pre-Release Center in Ohio, Lucasville. You know, Jackson, right? Jackson Reformatory up in Michigan. That one, that's Attica, right? Walnut Street. Yeah, I don't care what you pick. Just pick an institution and try to develop a theoretical or conceptual argument. Use that video, How to Write a Great Paper, again, right? How to write a great paper. Use that video just so you can frame your argument, because we can still say that those theories make sense. Conflict theory, well, why is it the prisons are disproportionately filled with the poor? Does that mean the wealthy don't commit crime, right? Or is it functional to remove persons from the streets and put them in prison, right? Functionalist theory. Or is it just symbolic that we punish people, right? So for example, the draconian drug laws passed in 1986, was that really a crime control measure, or was it a symbolic gesture saying as a symbol that this group is evil and they are a threat to our societies, in our moral system, right? So, you know, think about the theories behind the scenes. Try to write that conceptual introduction, then do some background on it, right? What was taking place in terms of crime when that institution was created? We have super maximum security institutions. Choose one, right? Choose a super max, because super maxes, and I've always kind of been a fan of them, because I I think we don't need to put all these people in prison over drug laws, right? Because we're asking the wrong question, I think. We're not asking the question of what generates the pain that people need drugs, right? What's generating the demand? We're not asking those questions. We're just putting a drug trafficker in prison or an abuser, what have you. And so I'm more interested in what's the pain behind it, okay? But we don't need, look, what, are you serious? Larceny theft? Send somebody to prison for 5 years for larceny theft or something like that? 3 strikes and you're out? Those are just habitual offender laws that go back into the 1930s. We act like they're new. It's called the cyclicity of ideas. Old ideas disappear, they come back and they get repackaged, but it's the same thing. You know, you switch from liberal rehabilitation to conservative to get tough, right, retribution, and it just sways back and forth. It gets repackaged in a new way, but it's the same underlying philosophy. So what I want you to do, take a look at the philosophy. Take a look in the background. What was the context of crime and our arguments of for or against punishment at the period of time in which it was built? What theory best explains this? Is it a conflict theory or is it a functionalist theory? Give me some data. There's got to be some kind of data that says whether or not the prison is successful, is it failing, you know, things of that nature. How do you get indicators that show that? And then analyze it, right? Therefore, I can conclude that prisons are a reflection of broader ideological systems within society. Draw that out, draw your conclusion, boom, you have a paper. All you need is 2 to 3 pages. Oh, by the way, you're doing fantastic. Everything I've graded for all 9 classes this semester, and I'm way behind, I know, but they're fantastic. So at this point, most people, I've given out a couple B's and a couple C's. The couple C's were strictly because of the fact that people did an assignment. They only submitted 1 paragraph, and there was no way that they could do it based upon what the assignment was. And then the other one was just a little bit off, but like Aradio in here. I don't know what you've done this semester, Aradio, but you just caught fire, and everything you've turned in has just been at, you know, top tier, upper level. So in any case, keep following that structure. Try to look at this from a conceptual perspective, not a descriptive one, and have fun with this assignment. All right? With that, and then I think 2 weeks afterwards, which is 3 weeks from now, I believe you have a term paper, and then 5 weeks from now, it's you construct what you think is the best correction system, right? And you can think about this. It's really a thought game. You use the structure, and it's going to be beautiful. But right now, I know everyone's complaining about me and stuff like that, but it's looking like there's going to be quite a few A's, almost all A's. So just keep doing what you're doing, follow those structural rules, and you're going to be fantastic. For those of you who celebrate Halloween and enjoy that day, have a great Halloween, have a great weekend, and I will see you in 2 weeks. Take care. But watch the announcement board.